Well, hey everyone, it's Greg Vinall here from the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast. Now, you're probably wondering why it is that I'm whispering. After all, I'm generally a fairly vocal sort of a guy. Well, the fact is, in today's episode, I'm going to share a secret with you. And it's a secret that once you understand it and once you get to know it, you'll use it all the time to be able to find fish wherever you find yourself fishing. Now, some of you will know this secret and some of you will partially know this secret. And for others, this will be brand new. But whichever one of those categories you think you might fall in, my aim today is to get you thinking differently about this secret. So what are we talking about today? Shh! Talking about how to fish eddies. And if there's one thing more certain than the fact that eddies hold fish, it's that I can't continue to talk this quietly. So when we come back from the intro music, I'm going back to my normal speaking voice.
This is the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast, where our mission is to help everyday sports fishers experience extraordinary lure fishing. If next level fishing is your dream, then let us provide the tools and information that will bring that dream to life. Tune in as our expert hosts chat with Australia's best anglers and share their tips for success. Then check out our website. It's one of Australia's largest and most popular online fishing resources. But right now, settle in to listen as ALF founder Greg Doc Lures Vinall delivers today's episode through the nerdy lens of a scientist, lure maker, and sport fishing tragic.
Well, hey there, ALF listeners, and thank you for joining me in today's episode. Normally I have a guest on the show to talk about some aspect of fishing, but every now and then, regular listeners know that I throw that script away and I just go on a kind of a solo rant. And today, it's definitely solo rant time. And as I whispered in your ear before the intro music, I tell you what, that was hard. I broke out in a sweat trying to keep my voice down that low. I'm not good at talking quietly. You might have worked that out if you've been listening to the podcast for a while. And there really wasn't a snowball's hope in hell that I was going to be able to keep that going for the entire episode. But, luckily for you, I don't think you want to listen to me whispering in your ear for an entire episode. So today's rant is all about understanding eddies and understanding how eddies are a prime place where fish gather and congregate and feed really aggressively as well. There's a whole bunch of reasons why that's the case, and anyone who's been a fly fisher for a while, well, they'll know exactly what I'm talking about. The trout guys, they're right onto this, okay? But it's not just about eddies in river systems. Eddies occur all over the place in all of our waterways, and a lot of people don't recognise the different types and scales and forms of eddies. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and help you to recognise them, because just quietly, when I hit the water at a new location, one of the things I'm thinking about is always at the front of my mind, where are the eddies? Where are the eddies in this system? Whether it's a lake, whether it's an estuary, whether it's a bay, whether it's, doesn't matter, offshore, coral reef, doesn't matter. I'm always looking for places where there are eddies. Now, a lot of people are looking for the snags or the weed beds or something like that, and those can be great places to fish, don't get me wrong. And you've definitely found the El Dorado if you find snags and weed beds and other structures that are within an eddy. That's definitely a place that you want to spend some time putting in some serious effort and some serious casts. So while the idea of finding eddies and fishing them might seem a little bit old hat, a little bit simplistic, what we're going to do today is get a little bit deeper, if you'll excuse the pun. We're going to get a little bit deeper into eddies and get you thinking about what eddies might be in places where you never thought there would be an eddy. And I'm getting sick of saying the word eddy now. So this is probably the perfect time to segue and tell you a little bit about the sponsor for today's episode. Because yes, we actually have a sponsor for today's ALF episode, which is brought to you by the Jabbers Urban Beats Deft Flicker Travel Rod. Now this lightweight, fast action 5-piece travel rod has actually carved out a real niche in my tackle room. In fact, it's displaced a number of my rods. And for very, very good reason. It's so portable, it's so lightweight, it's so responsive. It is just a joy to fish with, and I can take it anywhere with me. Now, I could do a whole podcast episode on this rod, but I'm not going to. What I'm going to do is direct you to my website, doclures.com/deft, doclures.com/DEFT. Go and check that out, because that link is going to take you to a page where you can see my grab and go fishing system. This is a system that allows me to just grab, as the name suggests, grab a pack that's small and lightweight, 50 centimetres long in a semi-hard case that I can stick under the seat of the car, throw in my bag as I'm getting on a plane. Doesn't really matter. Wherever I finish up, I've got a rod, I've got terminals, I've got lures, and I'm ready to fish no matter where I end up being. And it allows me to take advantage of all these tiny little micro fishing opportunities that spring up as I'm driving down the road and I look over the bridge and see see an eddy or see a fish or see a spray of prawns. I can jump out within 10 minutes. I can be fishing. Within 30 minutes, I can be back on the road again doing whatever it is I have to do. But it allows me to take advantage of all these opportunities, which means that my casting's dialed in. My skills are maintained so that when I go on a more serious fishing trip, I don't spend the first half of it casting into trees or missing bites because my skills and my reflexes are honed, tuned, and ready to go right from the get-go. So go and check it out, doclures.com/deft. If you don't have something like this in your arsenal, you really should have it make a huge difference. And if you haven't heard of jabbers, well, stay tuned because in the coming weeks and months, you're probably going to hear a fair bit more about these guys on the ALF podcast. Some of the tackle that they're bringing to Australia is very innovative, very cool, unlocks all kinds of opportunities, and it's well priced as well. So that's Jabbers Australia. As I said, you're going to hear more about them in the coming weeks and months. All right, we've got a little bit off topic. Let's get back to talking about eddies now. I get a bit excited and I get a bit carried away when I talk about the deft flicker. If you ever pick one up and have a fish with it, you'll understand why. Anyway, let's talk eddies because these systems, and these are constantly changing systems as well, I might add, but eddies are systems that invariably nearly always hold fish. And once you know what to look for, they're pretty easy to spot, whether you're on the water looking for them or even before you leave home, if you jump on Google Earth or you look at drone footage or whatever you do when you're researching a fishing spot, you can pretty much figure out where there are going to be eddies at various stages depending on conditions. And that can be a major starting point for figuring out and unlocking a new waterway and breaking it down so that you're not wasting time going to places where there are no fish. Because as we all know, fish are not evenly distributed through a system. They congregate. There's patches of fish where the conditions suit them, where there's food or where there's habitat or where there's current breaks, whatever it might be that causes fish to be in that area. They're not scattered evenly throughout the system. And understanding eddies and water circulation, well, that's a really quick way to figure out some of the key places where fish are likely to be aggregated. And for those people who are part of my Team Doc Lures member program, this is one of the things that we're going to talk about in the video tutorial that's dropping tomorrow, which is really about using AI tools, free AI tools or cheap AI tools to be able to plan and prepare yourself for a fishing trip and doing it in a way that you don't get all this generic rubbish thrown up, okay? Really useful information that can help you plan a fishing trip. So one of the things that I will show you in that tutorial is how to use eddies to identify some potential hotspots. So that's dropping tomorrow, and that's going to be followed by monthly live streams where we're going to randomly choose fishing spots or fishing locations and do a breakdown of them. And so we'll be doing a little bit of the identification of eddies for that as well. Now, obviously, you can only identify where an eddy is and what it's doing if you know what you're looking for, if you know what an eddy is. So let's just start today's episode by defining what an eddy is. And all the hairs right now are standing up on the back of my neck because I know that a whole bunch of ALF listeners are rolling their eyes and thinking to themselves, come on, Greg, how basic can you get? We all know what an eddy is. Well, if you're one of those people, then just bear with me for a little bit. Maybe you do. Maybe you know exactly what an eddy is. Maybe you don't. But unless you listen through this, you won't know for sure, will you? Because there's all kinds of different factors. I want to broaden your thinking about eddies and circulation currents more generally. So essentially, an eddy is anywhere in a system where the water's flowing in one direction and some kind of obstruction or structure or opposing water mass causes some of that water to flow back in the opposite direction. So the classic eddy is when you've got a river system flowing, obviously, as they do from upstream to downstream, uphill, upslope to downslope. So the water's flowing essentially one direction. But what happens is when you have bends in the river, when you have little occlusions in the bank, when you have a structure or a weed bank or something like that, that causes that flow to deflect and actually reverse back on itself. And we've all seen this. It's like a little, Coriolis plug hole effect. You get the water flowing back along the bank and then it rejoins the main channel and it flows downstream. And so you get this small patch of water, or I shouldn't say small patch of water because it's not always small, but you get this patch of water where it would seem to be in a very small limited area running back up current, back up against the main flow. It's going up the slope, right? And it's because of this, piece of structure or this shape of the bank or whatever it is that's caused that water to deflect. Now, I've painted the simplest and the most obvious and recognisable form of eddy. That's that river flow up. As I said earlier, trout fishers are very, very familiar with it. Every small creek right up to the major trout rivers, there's always eddies. They're always a prime place to fish. But as you move downstream towards the coast, well, estuaries have eddies as well. And estuaries become a little bit more complex because the water can flow in different directions depending on what the tide's doing. So you can have eddies that form and hold fish on the incoming tide, and then other eddies that form and hold fish on the outgoing tide. Often one of the things that makes them really recognisable, particularly if you've got fast-moving water, this is in fast-flowing streams or places where you've got really strong tidal movement, is that you get foam on the top. You can see the foam circulating around. So the saying foam is home, well, that's definitely the case for lots of fish, particularly predatory fish. Now, once again, estuaries, that's a reasonably obvious one. I guess most anglers will be familiar with eddies that occur in estuarine systems. But what about lakes? What about eddies in lakes? Do eddies exist in lakes? Well, actually, yes, they do, because lakes, despite the fact that they look like they might not have any water movement or any water flow, they're actually constantly getting water movement as a result of wind turbation. So the eddies in lake systems, well, they're a little bit complex, a bit like estuarine systems. They can form depending on which way the wind's been blowing, and not just the wind at the current time, but the wind over the past few days. So in a way, eddies in lake systems potentially could form at any point of the compass, right? Depending on where the structure is and which way the wind is moving water. In reality, of course, most systems, we've got predominant winds, and so we can kind of figure out where the eddies are based on those predominant winds. So if you're a lake fisher and you've never really thought about eddies as being something you need to consider, well, think again, because they really do drive not just the congregation, aggregation and feeding of fish, but they also drive the entire ecosystem in those lake systems, whether it's a small pond or a massive reservoir. What about our coastal systems? Can eddies form there? Well, absolutely. So if you think about anywhere where the wind is blowing across a headland, on the lee side of that headland, you're going to get an eddy form. If you think about rock walls and breakwaters at the ends of river mouths or at the mouths of rivers where they meet the ocean, typically you get some longshore current in those places and there'll be eddies formed around the ends of the rock walls. Think about most bays, coastal inlets, tidal lakes. They all have places where eddies form and where the thinking angler has an opportunity to figure out where the fish might gather. Now, something to be aware of is at the start of describing what an eddy is, I talked about trout streams, right? And these are quite localized, often quite small eddies. Some of them might be the size of a bathtub. Some of them might be the size of a car. Some of them might be a little bit larger, but they're still quite small and confined, particularly when you consider them in the context of an eddy that might form in a large storage. So let's say Eildon or Peter Faust or whatever your favourite fishing lake or dam is. You get likely to get much bigger eddies form there and much less obvious, but nonetheless, just as important, if not more so, for determining where the fish are and how they're behaving. It doesn't stop there either. There are eddies in the surf zone. There are eddies on rocky headlands and ledges where you might go game fishing, up to and including oceanic currents. And this is something that game fishers, blue water fishers, and bottom bashers, deep water jiggers, are really, really familiar with. And often these aren't formed so much by structure, though sometimes they are. But if you're out off the shelf, then often these eddies that we see are more about different water masses, whether they be different temperature or different chemistry kind of reacting together. And the way I like to describe it is, you take a glass of water and you pour down one side of the glass some raspberry cordial, okay? It doesn't just empty into the glass and immediately colour the entire glass raspberry colour. What it does is it seeps down, it's heavier than the water, and it swirls and eddies around and starts to mix through. That's what's going on at a much larger scale, obviously, in our oceans. And so on the east coast of Australia, for example, some of the best fishing comes when you have an eddy that's formed and it's actually channeling water at right angles to the East Australian current. It's pushing water in towards the coast and bringing predatory fish, bringing bait and plankton and all that sort of thing towards the coast. That's a prime time to go game fishing. And we kind of think of that as being all about currents, but actually, those currents are forming eddies and pockets. And you know what? It doesn't end there either, because if you think about places where there are upwellings, you think about places where there are, what we refer to as pressure edges or pinch points or downwellings as well as another one. These are examples of eddies that are, rather than horizontal like the ones we've discussed up until this point, they're actually vertical eddies. And they usually occur when a current strikes a reef or some other structure, the continental shelf, whatever it might be, and that causes, in the example, say if an upwelling, what it's doing is it's causing water to circulate around vertically so that nutrients and plankton and all kinds of stuff are being brought up from the depths to the surface, and the result is you get an aggregation of fish. Now, this can happen a long way out at sea with a very deep piece of structure that, it might be hundreds of meters below the surface of the water, but suddenly in this apparently vast expanse of blue ocean that all looks the same, there's this one patch. But that one patch could be bringing plankton and nutrients, all kinds of stuff that causes bait fish aggregate, which attracts predators. And so you finish up with this amazingly productive system that's sitting above some underwater structure, and it's purely because of the circulation, the eddying of water that struck that piece of structure. So I hope you're starting to get the idea that whilst the idea and the concept of an eddy is a reasonably simple one that most of us can grasp, once you recognize them and once you understand them a little bit, it's a ticket to finding fish much more easily. And here's the thing. Typically fish that are in eddies, more often than not, they're going to be feeding fish. So that's a really key point. You're not just finding fish, you're finding feeding fish. Because typically, not always, but typically when a fish is sitting in an eddy, it's having to hold station. It's not having to use a lot of energy. That's one of the things that attracts fish to that eddy scenario. But they do need to hold station. Fish that have already fed and they're in digestion mode, they're more likely to go off and find somewhere quiet, deep, out of the current, where they can just basically rest and sleep it off. Same as you and I. Once they've gorged themselves, they need to go and sleep it off. So to better understand why it is that fish congregate in and around eddies, let's have a bit of a think about what those essentially hydraulic structures are providing the fish. So the first thing is, typically where there's an eddy, that because there's water movement, the circulation, quite often there's turbulent circulation. You get whirlpool. You think about the eddies that form, for example, at the Rip around Queenscliff in southern Victoria. You get some massive whirlpools there that form. So anytime you've got that kind of circulation going on and you've got lots of turbulence happening and foam on the surface, then you know that the water's getting aerated. There's plenty of dissolved oxygen in there. And when there's lots of dissolved oxygen, that tends to cause fish to become more active. This is the aquatic version of what Olympic runners do, right? This is the aquatic version of blood doping. The fish get in there because they get lots of oxygen through their gills and it energizes them. So that's the first thing. The other thing it does is it accumulates potential food sources. Now, if you think about, let's go back to the riverine system. Let's talk bass, trout, yellowbelly, Saratoga, whatever you like, mangrove jack, sooty grunter, you name a species. So all of these fish tend to feed on, a whole range of different things. But if they're omnivorous species, then eddies are a place where anything that comes floating down the system on that current gets trapped. So insects and various different food items that are swept down by the current end up circulating around in these eddies in the backwaters. And they're easy pickings for the fish, right? The water flow is a lot slower. These things are trapped there. They can just go along and pick them off as they want to. Now, for more predatory species that are more piscivorous, so fish-eating species like Murray cod, again, mangrove jack, barramundi, Saratoga, anything that eats other fish, well, they're attracted to the eddies because, of course, eddies bring food for small bait fish. So the small bait fish congregate there too. There's another aspect as well that keeps the bait fish in an eddy, and that is the current flow. So bait fish tend to be quite small. They tend to not be particularly strong swimmers because they've got small tail, small body mass. They get pushed around by the current a lot more than some of the bigger predatory fish. And so what an eddy does for a bait fish is it gives it a current break. It gives the bait fish the opportunity to get out of the current. Now, if you're talking about an estuarine system or you're talking about a coastal system, they might sit in the eddy for a little while waiting for conditions to change, and then they'll move out. If you're talking about a river system, they might stage up there before they push up into the current to the next eddy. From a lure fishing perspective, it doesn't matter. All you need to know is eddies are places where food gathers, both insects and anything else that floats down the river, but also prawns and bait fish and those sorts of things. Now, I'm going to describe an eddy that I fish up here in Cairns, land-based. And I want you to close your eyes. Don't close your eyes if you're driving, okay? If you're listening to this in the car, maybe don't close your eyes. But if you're in any other kind of scenario, it's safe to do so. Close your eyes and imagine what I'm about to describe for you, because I guarantee you can think of something that fits this kind of description within your own fishing scenario. And the eddy that I'm talking about is a tidal eddy. So it flows, it only basically forms on the incoming tide, but it's a place where the tide pushes up through a series of culverts. Now, if you're standing between the culverts and you cast into that eddy, you can work your lure very, very slowly. It can be lightly weighted if you're using a soft plastic. You can get it right down to the bottom, no problems whatsoever. As that lure gets just slowly washed around by the circulating water in the eddy, it'll eventually reach a point where it gets swept up at the edges, at the periphery of the eddy, by the water that's whistling past. It's coming through those culverts. And so you go suddenly from your lure easily reaching the bottom and being able to be slowly worked along the bottom, but suddenly it's getting swept up off the bottom and whooshed away, and you've got an enormous current pressure on the lure. Now, if you've got that mental image, if you can think of a scenario in your own fishing world that's a bit like that, then you'll understand exactly where I'm coming from. I'm describing what I would probably refer to as a fairly tight eddy. In other words, the boundary between that slowly moving, slowly circulating water and the rapidly flowing water is really quite narrow. So a predatory fish can sit within 6, 8, 10 inches of that fast flowing water and not expend a lot of energy, right? And so it can see stuff coming down on that current, duck out and grab it, and then back into the slack water. So it's saving a lot of energy. It's also having food brought to it in oxygenated water. It's just a perfect scenario for a fish, right? For a predatory fish. Now, there are other reasons as well why fish might inhabit an eddy, and we've already talked about, upwellings and downwellings in oceanic scenarios. We've talked about beaches, gutters and channels and holes on beaches. Fish come into those because food swept into them. But also they can get underneath the foam and, they feel protected. The water's a little bit deeper, all that kind of stuff. But whatever the motivation, the basic, premise that we're talking about here is eddies hold fish. Eddies attract fish for a whole range of reasons. No matter what species you're talking about, this is a really important concept to understand. So you really want to make it your business to understand and look for eddies and current formations that are going to hold fish. And especially where they're not so obvious. Because trust me, as I've said, if you're fishing in a lake, eddies are just as important as if you're fishing in a fast-flowing river, if not at times more so. Now, here's something else for you to consider. Just because you've found fish, and just because you know that they're active fish, feeding fish, the fact that they're actually in an eddy probably indicates that they're energized and that they're looking for things to chew, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to catch them, any more than seeing active feeding fish on your fish finder means that you're going to catch them either. And I guarantee that just about everybody listening here today, if you're a keen fisher, you spend a lot of time on the water, you've experienced situations where you've found the fish, you can see the fish, you cannot get them to take a lure, and there's a very good reason why that's often the case. And I'll tell you something just quietly, and I'm not going to whisper again, I'm going to say it out loud. If you are one of my Team Doc Lures members, in other words, you're one of my favorite people because you recognize the work and the cost and the effort and the commitment it takes to run a podcast in the long term, and you support me by becoming one of my members, well, guess what? I'm going to share with you the secret strategies that I use for fishing in eddies. Because there's a couple of things, and once you know them, they're as plain as the nose on your face, right? Once you understand this, you're going to go, oh my God, why didn't I see this earlier? And it'll really change the way you approach fishing, particularly in new spots that you haven't fished before. You'll pick the places to fish much quicker, and you'll figure out how to fish them much quicker as well. So Team Doc Lures members, stick around. I'm going to take you through some pro strategies for fishing eddies. Everybody else, we'll be back shortly to continue our conversation on the importance of eddies as magnets to fish. Okay, ALF listeners, if you feel like you're on hold right now, you've got the elevator music, you feel like you're just in a holding pattern, well, you kind of are, because as you sit here listening to this, I'm off sharing some pro-level tips with my Team Doc Lures members. So these are the people that support the podcast, help to keep us on air, and so I share my pro-level fishing secrets with those guys. And I try to keep some really juicy stuff for them. So if you're not a Team Doc Lures member, you've kind of got three options. You can either continue to be on the sidelines and miss out on that pro-level stuff, Or you can join Team Dock Lures. That's your second option. Go over to team.docklures.com. That's team, team.docklures.com. And for about the same as what you'd pay for a pint of beer at your local pub once a month, you can get access to all that pro level information that's going to set you up for a lifetime of better fishing. And it's not just extended podcast editions either. It's ebooks, it's live streams, it's tutorials, it's a whole bunch of stuff, tackle deals, all sorts of stuff over at the Team Dock Lures website. Right now you've also got a third option, and that is you could jump over to my website at docklures.com/deft, D-E-F-T, docklures.com/deft, and you could check out my grab and go fishing system. Because right now you can actually get the grab and go fishing system for 33% off, a third off the normal cost. And it includes that awesome Jabbers Urban Beats Deft Flicker travel rod that I talked about earlier on. It includes hand-selected tackle that will enable you to catch fish anywhere. It also includes a membership to Team Dock Lures, so you won't be listening to the elevator music anymore. You'll be getting the pro-level information with the rest of my elite Team Dock Lures members. Now that deal is for a strictly limited time, okay? We can't give away Deft Flicker rods and tackle packs at 33% off forever, so it's while stocks last or until our promotion runs out, so go and check it out. That's docklures.com/DEFT, deft, docklures.com/deft, and jump on an awesome deal on a grab and go system that will enable you to keep your skills sharp, catch more fish, and give you access to the pro level information in Team Dock Lures. docklures.com/deft. Now folks, I don't know about you, but I've had about as much elevator music as I can handle for one day. So let's go back to the conversation about fishing eddies, and I'll share with you some more information about how you can take advantage of those places where fish gather and feed. Now, having shared what I reckon is probably the hottest tip of this entire episode, now it's probably time to bring regular members of the public back into our conversation. So I'm going to finish off this discussion about fishing in eddies by talking a little bit about tackle and talking a little bit about lures. Now, do you need special tackle, especially to fish in estuary? Well, I'm sure there's lots of manufacturers would love to tell you that you do. And if you're like me and you've got way too much tackle but not enough tackle, you probably love for them to tell you that you do, so that you've got an excuse and a justification for buying some more. But the truth is, you can use whatever tackle you'd normally use to fish other sort of scenarios. You typically can also use that tackle to fish within an eddy. One thing I would say though, and this is perhaps a personal view or perhaps not, I don't know, but I would typically be wanting to use the thinnest diameter line that I could get away with for fishing areas where there are lots of eddies. And typically that would mean fishing braid and fishing the lightest braid that I could. Now, the reason for that, well, there's a few reasons for it, but the key reason for that is that you've got this kind of turbulent water that can be flowing in multiple directions. And that causes a few issues when you're trying to present your lure in a natural way. Because what happens is your lure's being pushed by the current in one direction and your line's being pushed in a different direction. So it causes your lure to swim in ways that bait fish wouldn't. It can create kind of big sags and bellies in your line, S-shaped type bellies in your line, so you can miss bites, not even see bites. Or if you do see the bite, you might struggle to set the hooks. So of course, fine line, much less drag from the water, so you have less issues with that. But also keep the leader pretty short in those circumstances for the same reason. The leader tending to be fluorocarbon or monofilament is going to be a bit thicker than the braid, and so it's going to get swirled around more by the turbulence as well. In terms of lure choices, I mean, again, you can use pretty much whatever lures you'd normally use, but a couple of considerations. If you're using hard bodies, for example, diving minnow style lures, they tend to get caught up in the turbulence. They tend to get their action tends to get knocked. You've got line being drawn in one direction, the lure being drawn in another. They can blow out and roll on their sides and look unnatural. And here I'm focusing on the sort of river and estuary sort of scenario, maybe not so much in the lake systems, coastal systems, although sometimes it can be. But typically smaller lures and more heavily weighted lures that don't get moved around by the current as much tend to be more effective. So think of things like, in a trout stream, it might be lead-headed jigs, small soft plastics on a jig head, might be inline spinners, metal spinner blades. In a bass stream, it could be similar things and perhaps chatterbaits and those sorts of things as well. Topwater lures can work quite well in eddies too under the right circumstances. And I know plenty of scenarios where top waters in an eddy will pick up barra, they'll pick up threadfin, sooty grunter, Saratoga down south, mulloway, estuary perch, bass, bream as well. They are influenced a little bit by the, multi-directional current, so they can be a little bit tricky to fish, but perhaps a little less so than a diving hard-bodied lure. For fishing those tighter type eddy systems, a reasonably fast action rod, perhaps a little bit longer, a reasonably high speed reel, they're all things that are going to help you to stay in touch with the lure, get the slack out of the line, set a hook if you need to. So, I don't know anybody who has a dedicated eddy fishing outfit, right? But if you think about just the characteristics of fishing in an eddy and the characteristics of the tackle that's going to give you the best opportunity, that kind of describes it for me. So I think we're getting close to concluding today's solo rant, but I'll leave you with one final thought. In a lot of cases, an eddy, and I'm focused here on, particularly on tight eddies, so in river systems, in streams, in estuaries where you've got really fast flowing water, not so much in ocean systems, and it can happen in ocean systems, but in those places where you've got a small eddy with fast flowing water on one or both sides of it, what you've effectively got is like a little microcosm. It's kind of like a cyclone. You've got fast flow all the way around, but you've got this patch in the middle that is slow flow, and it isolates the fish that are in that central patch where the flow is kind of multi-directional but slow, and it's really quite easy and relaxed for the fish to be in there, and it kind of isolates them from the rest of the river system. And by that I mean, it makes it difficult for them to hear, smell, and experience through the lateral line what's going on outside of this little bubble that they're in. And that's one of the reasons that when you find fish in these eddy systems, they're feeding, they're active, they're energized, they're not as distracted by sounds, they're not as sensitive. If you kick a stone while you're waiting, if you drop a sinker in the bottom of the boat, it may still spook them, but it's less likely to spook them than a fish that's in a sort of quiet system, which means it's a little bit more forgiving, a little bit easier to hook those fish. And Team Doc Lures guys, you know exactly what you need to do to make that happen. So folks, that is the end of today's episode. If you would like to check out the show notes, go over to doclures.com, type 663 into the search bar. This is episode 663. It'll bring up the show notes, the downloads, all that kind of stuff to go with this episode. So go and check that out. Otherwise, folks, I'm going to leave you with it. I will be back next week with some new episodes of the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast. So until then, be safe on the roads, be safe on the water. I will see you out there sometime. Tight lines. See you soon.
Thanks for listening to the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast. For free show notes, downloads, tools and resources, please visit our website on doclures.com or consider supporting the show by joining Team Doc Lures to receive exclusive members-only episodes, tools and resources. But for now, tight lines and may the fish be with you.